just, no, silent.
Silent.
Okay. Yes. Welcome everybody to this very important session. We think it's a very important, very timely session right now about press censorship and the violence against journalists in India and in Pakistan. So when we talk about Pakistan, we somehow feel that it's accepted that there is a lot of violence against journalism. There must be a lot of press censorship as well. But I guess what is very surprising right now is the trend that India is taking. Now we see in the last few years, we have seen India slipping in the World Press Index. And as fate would have it, we are neighbors again on the latest World Press Index. India is at 138. We are 139. Dismal ranking on just 180 countries. So we're going to discuss all of that, how that happened. Very timely because Pakistan and India were almost at the brink of war less than 2 months ago. And India goes to elections next week, a long election that possibly we don't understand how it works. Let me just introduce my panelists to you. We have journalists and media professionals from Pakistan and 2 from India. Gul Bukhari is sitting right here next to me. She's a media and development professional. She's a columnist. She writes on current affairs. She writes on civil-military relationship in Pakistan, human rights, freedom of the press. And she also writes for an Indian outlet, The Print. And anybody who follows Pakistan on social media probably knows Gul Bukhari. There's Taha Siddiqui, who is an award-winning journalist. He's been covering Pakistan for a very long time, now lives in Paris with his family. He's in exile, and he will tell us why and how that happened. He also manages safenewsrooms.org, which is a website that documents media censorship in Asia. Rana Ayub, investigative journalist from India. She's most well known for her book, which is Gujarat Files, Anatomy of a Cover-Up. And she is also regarded as one of the bravest journalists from India. And we'll find out more about that book, where she went undercover for a very long time to write that book. And Ritu Kapoor, who is the founder and CEO of The Quint, a news website in Hindi and in English. But she's been with the mainstream media for a very long time in many different roles. And she continues to promote platforms that promote freedom of the press, citizen journalism. So this is our panel now. Gul, can we start with a bit of a chilling story? 5th of June, 2018, you were going to a television channel to attend a talk show late at night. Can you tell us what happened? Yes.
Thank you, Alia, and thank you everyone who's attending. I was working with a news group by the name of Waqt, and I was writing a column for their English language newspaper and was an analyst on one of their current affairs talk shows, which would run 3 times a week or something. And on that particular day, the show was going to be at 11 o'clock at night, and I used to go to it regularly, but we would normally communicate on WhatsApp about, the time or whatever. On that day, when the producer called, he called on the regular phone line, and I said, okay, fine, but it's really late this time. It was the month of Ramadan, so normal time used to be 7 p.m., but now it had been delayed to 11 p.m. So when he said it's going to be tonight at 11 p.m., I said, okay, just send me the car. And so the car came, and I got into it, and when we got to a very main road in the cantonment area, I lived in the cantonment area, suddenly a lot of cars surrounded us and got us off the road, And the driver went out and he was talking to these people who were saying this car is a stolen one. And I said, what nonsense? I got out of the car and I said, who are you people and what's going on? And they said, well, this car is a stolen one. And I sensed it within a few seconds that something is really wrong. So I started to run to cross the middle barrier and to the other side. But there were about at least 15 people in a lot of cars who had come out, and 4 or 5 of them tried to get hold of me. And then there were also men in uniform holding guns and guarding the abduction. So I think the struggle lasted for about 5 minutes maybe, after which I was shoved into the car, and by this time I was screaming, so then I was choked so that I wouldn't scream. And after that I was bound and blindfolded and driven off. So this was this is what happened. And unbeknownst to me, obviously, this news of what had happened broke within 10 or 11 minutes on social media, and it was picked up by journalists, different news organizations, political parties, party heads, and it went into the mainstream and international media within about an hour and a half. And there was a lot of pressure that got built up. I did not know this. I was obviously in captivity. And I think because of all the outrage, because of the way in which it was done, because of the location where it was done, all of these details had come out, so the world was very aware of who done it because of the circumstances. I was still in captivity, but everybody, figured it out. And the way the reporting was done also talked about what she writes about, what she criticizes, and so everybody's fingers pointed to who done it. And I was then released and driven back home because of all this pressure after 4 hours. After 4 hours. But this was not the only way of curbing freedom of expression or dissent. A lot else had been happening and kept on happening. So this includes threats, this includes getting you fired from your news organization. It includes having your columns blocked, dropped from the websites. It includes abuse and threats on social media, to the extent where you look at your timeline and you cannot have a conversation with anybody, because if somebody responds to a point I've made, I won't even be able to find them, because in the notifications there's just total abuse,
There's always a context that is built before something like that happens. We'll talk about social media in a while. I just wanted to move to Taha, who experienced something quite familiar and similar to what Gul is talking about. And also it happened at the time when in Pakistan a lot of bloggers and activists would go missing. So that context is also very important. Taha, can you tell us what happened with you? Because you escaped a kidnapping attempt in Islamabad. Can you tell us why?
Yeah. So basically, similar to what just Gul mentioned, I was on my way to the airport. I was traveling to London on 10th of January last year, so 2018, 10th of January. And on the way to the airport, there were armed men who forcibly stopped the taxi I was traveling in on a main highway. And they basically were armed. There were one car in the front, one vehicle in the back, and they tried to take me away. first they were basically, they started to beat me, and then they were managing the traffic, they encircled me, and it was like 8 o'clock in the morning, so there was a lot of people, traffic, school-going children. And later on, a student also came forward and said she was the only eyewitness that came forward, even though there were thousands of people that must have passed, but that's the kind of fear that people have, that they don't come forward. So, but they basically managed to then put me down on the floor, pick me up, and then put me back in the taxi, and then took over the taxi, and then were driving off when I jumped off from one of the doors and ran and managed to get to a police station. So then I basically, so the context, you're talking about the context, so I just try to bring that in, because these kind of abductions have been happening a lot. There have been people who've been gone missing for 4 weeks. She was gone for 4 hours. There have been people missing for, even until now, like for years. We don't know where they are, but usually the suspicion is that mostly, if they're journalists or if their work is related to what we're doing, it's mostly to do with the military, the Pakistan military. And in my context, it started with, I've been a reporter in Pakistan, or used to be a reporter in Pakistan for like 14 years. And the first time I got this threat was back in 7 years ago, when I did a story about how we were not able to report freely in the tribal belt. So it was an analysis story talking about how the tribal belt, where the war on terror operations are going on. There's a lot of embedded reporting. So I criticized and talked to people, local reporters, and on that I got a call. I got called to the military media wing, which is the DG ISPR, or ISPR is called the military media wing. So they call journalists there, or they call them on their phones. They're brigadiers, colonels usually. So that was the first time that it happened. Then on and off, I would get calls. My wife would get harassed also. My friends who would come visit would get harassed and were told not to visit us. And then in 2017, there's a Federal Investigation Authority, FIA, in the country, which manages criminal cases and terrorism cases. And they basically called me in for a cybercrime and counterterrorism investigation for a list that was circulating, which said that I had maligned the military online and social media posts. I did not go to them. I went to the Islamabad High Court and I challenged it with a lawyer. And then the FIA backed off, but that was in 2017 June, and then 2018, then they tried to kidnap me. And then another thing that I want to add to the context is that right after this kidnapping attempt and I escaping and surviving, I met with the country's interior minister at that time, because he invited me over to discuss my case. And so he's the interior minister, he's the boss of the law and order. And he told me that I should write an apology letter to the military chief and ask for an apology. And when I asked him about what, and he said, just say, forgive me for everything. And I was just like, this is you're his boss, and I thought of that. And then when the interior minister, then another friend of ours, a colleague journalist, met with the prime minister at that time, who was Nawaz Sharif, Shahid Khaqan Abbasi at that time. And Shahid Khaqan Abbasi said to a friend journalist that they're picking up people from our own political party, which was happening with PMLN, which was at that time the ruling party, that they were abducting political activists on social media, active on social media or television shows, or who were talking against the military and how the military was managing the elections. At that time, it was about the elections, but it's always about something. It's about their businesses, it's about their human rights abuses, it's about their military operations. The military is sort of in every sphere of sort of the country's affairs, and they do not want any talk on that. And so the interior minister and then the prime minister, when they said this, then within 2-3 weeks, I decided that the best way was to go remote and still talk about Pakistan. So I now am in Paris and trying to talk about Pakistan.
We'll hear more about that. Thank you, Taha. Rana, the situation is not quite the same in India, I suppose. You went undercover to Gujarat. You assumed a new identity. And you were in the thick of things. There were some dangerous people. Well, maybe not, but the things they were talking about seemed to be quite dangerous. There were some very interesting conversations. You had tapes, you recorded stuff. And it kind of indicted a lot of important people who were in power at the time. This is all regarding the Gujarat riots that took place in 2002, in which, what's the official number now that we accept? How many people died? 1,000 people were killed, mostly Muslims. And there were horror stories of what happened with children and women. And after that, Rana went undercover to Gujarat to find out more about the fake encounters. So you had a great story. So what happened when you came out with that story?
To begin with, I'm very grateful that unlike my Pakistani counterparts, I've never been abducted. So I'm really grateful to the Indian state.
Got full marks on that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm also glad that it's very heartening that India and Pakistani journalists are having conversations and dialogues, especially in the time when we are in the brink of war and nationalist journalists from our countries believe that there should be no people-to-people contact and journalists should not be in touch with each other. So this is quite promising and heartening, and that's how we go forward from here. So I've been an investigative journalist and writer from India, and I was one of the editors at Tehelka, which was one of the country's leading investigative news magazines. At the age of 26, I sent one of the first serving Home Ministers of India behind bars. I basically culled out his call records in the extrajudicial murder of Muslims during the period of 2002 and 2007. Of course, let me remind you that the man who went behind bars is now the second in command in India today as we speak. So you can understand how, my life must be really rosy right now in the country. After that, I decided to go undercover because the Chief Minister of Gujarat, who's now the Prime Minister of the country, Narendra Modi, there were allegations that he presided over a genocide of 1,000 Muslims under his watch. Commissions of inquiry could not prove anything. Of course, when you are a powerful minister, officials and bureaucrats do not depose against you because there's always a threat that they could be, you could suffer the repercussions. And the commissions of inquiry basically had no evidence against him. I actually became a journalist because I was a relief worker. I was 18 when I went to Gujarat during the Gujarat riots to basically be a relief worker, and that's one of the reasons why I decided to be a journalist. This was very close to my heart, especially as a child of the Bombay riots in '93 when we were thrown out of our house for 2 months. So I decided to go undercover. And I became this Hindu nationalist girl who stays in America, who is a student of the American Film Institute Conservatory. I had about 7 to 8 cameras on my body at any given point of time. There was something in my watch, something in my earring, something in my diary. I had a tunic, and the tunic had a camera fitted in it. And I started by, meeting the socialites, getting into the social circle of Gujarat, and then started infiltrating the ranks and file of Gujarat when Narendra Modi was then the provincial minister. And in course of 8 months, I became a part of their family to the extent that I would meet them every day, I would have conversations with them every day. And through a period of 8 months, there were damning confessions by bureaucrats, ministers, Home Secretary, and the last person I met was Narendra Modi himself. There were testimonies that the provincial head actually tacitly approved of the genocide of Muslims in his state, especially with his provocative speeches, and that he was responsible for all the murder of one of the home ministers of the state. And there was, damning testimony. So I come back like any excited journalist, believing that this is going to be the biggest story India has ever seen. And I come back to my organization and they say, the story can't be published because you've gone too far in the story. We did not anticipate that you would reach Narendra Modi. And there was political pressure and the story was killed. I mean, that's a bigger nightmare for any journalist as opposed to the troubles that you face, because, when your editors kill your story, you really don't know. I mean, these were the people you trusted the most. After that, I quit the organization in 2013, and I went to every journalism organization in the country, editors, journalists. They said, oh, this is a damning story. I mean, this is one of the biggest stories India has produced, but we can't publish it. Your Honor, you understand our compulsions. I did understand their compulsions. They all wanted to survive in the profession. I finally signed a book contract, a tell-all book contract, so that I could have all the sting footage in the book. So I went to one of the biggest publication houses. They decided to publish my book. And as we approached 2014, and when it became clear that Narendra Modi was all set to become the Prime Minister, they stopped taking my calls. For the next 1 month, they did not take my phone calls. And finally, I sent them an email saying, hey, I haven't heard from you guys. Where are we on the book? And if you're not interested, I think I'll pull out. Immediately came a response, please go ahead. I mean, that's the way of basically not saying no, and yet basically. And then I self-published because I was getting anxiety attacks. I had a nervous breakdown because it was difficult to sit with that kind of truth with you, with that kind of tapes, knowing that there is a minister who is complicit in a genocide, who is now your prime minister. It's difficult to sleep with that kind of information when you are unable to answer your conscience, at least as a journalist. So what I did was I decided to publish. My mom had kept some gold for me, so I pawned that gold. They took a gold loan and published about 500 copies, and I kept a book launch in Delhi. Almost every minister and every journalist turned up at a book launch, and I said, okay, wow, this is, and I got a standing ovation from the entire, there were 600 journalists and every minister from the Congress and the BJP. I believed that the next day this would be like the front page headline of every newspaper, and guess what happens? Not a single news story the next day. I wasn't really surprised, and this is how the media had become in India, and media was turning into it. But there was word of mouth, people were reading the book. It stormed into Amazon bestseller in the span, and in the last 2 years, I've sold about 500,000 copies in 16 languages. Perhaps that's a testimony that journalists might not be willing to tell the story, but people are eager to hear the story. That, though, has come with its share of witch hunt against me, to the extent that it does matter that I'm not just a critic of the ruling dispensation, that I'm also a Muslim woman and a practicing Muslim woman. And in the Hindu majoritarian scheme of things in India, that's a big deal.
But that's the new face of India that we're all seeing as well, in a way. I just wanted to bring Ritu in. And Ritu, you've been around for so long, and you've been a part of the mainstream media, especially the electronic media, and you watched how things happen. Can we say that in the sense of censorship, the media censorship landscape in India has changed from pre-2014, which was before Narendra Modi became Prime Minister, to post-2014? Is there a big new era?
Absolutely. I think there's absolutely no doubt, and it's more than evident. And you see it unfortunately, in a lot of capitulation by the mainstream media in the country. So unlike say the kind of stories that we've heard from Taha and Gul, actually some of the largest media organizations have actually become vehicles of propaganda and driving the agenda of a certain for the choice of a better word, ideology. That is in my view, that is one of the biggest problems, because that makes it very difficult for those of us who are continuing to critique the government, continuing to question the policies, continuing to fight against. There's such an environment of complete polarization currently in the country. There is actually, in the Hindu majoritarian state, there's actually an insecurity being drummed up on how the Hindus are under threat. There is this ridiculous situation of human beings being killed for being accused of cow slaughter, which is now called cow lynching in common parlance. what we are seeing is, I don't think I have. I'm told that there was a bit of this at the time of the emergency during the rule of Mrs. Indira Gandhi, but what I'm witnessing now over the last 4 or 5 years is completely unprecedented, and it's coming in many forms. It's coming in a lot of regulatory policies. You know, for instance, under orders from the Ministry of Health Affairs, there are 10 agencies, surveillance agencies, which have been empowered to intercept, monitor, decrypt the digital devices of all citizens. Now, I don't even know whether most citizens in India are aware of this. There are massive IT cells who are very, very well funded, who are the kind of people who are trolling people like Rana, trolling people like me, and believe me, I don't deserve that kind of trolling. She does. The defamation laws in India are unfortunately criminal. I think most journalists and most media organizations would have a whole bunch of defamation cases against them, because that's being used as, there's this complete intolerance. Because the minute you're questioning anything, the minute you're critiquing, you're seen as being agenda-driven and being with the opposition, and or being Pakistan-funded. And there is just no questioning, because now there is also the sentiment of anti-national. There's so much self-censorship in India, because there is the fear of being called an anti-national. So a lot of fact-based journalism has completely given way to safe journalism.
What about the ownership of media? When the big corporate, I mean, is that? We're talking about the Ambanis.
Most of either it's evident or it's behind the scenes. And ownership of media is a big issue. Not just ownership of media, but also funding models for a lot of media organizations. A lot of media in India continues to rely on government funding, government advertising funding, and that, of course, leads to self-censorship again. But, you know, there's so many ways. There is a slap cases, I don't know why it's called that, strategic lawsuits against public participation, but you will find a number of journalists who have been charged with slap by corporate houses. Now, for instance, we do, and I can tell you that at least 15 other media houses have that. We have a 10,000 crore lawsuit against us on having done a story against a corporate house, and we know where the affiliations of the corporate house are. Obviously, it's a meaningless...
You'll never be able to...
It's obviously meaningless. It's only harassment, and I haven't dealt with any of what these brave people have dealt with. I mean, the closest I've come to it was being held hostage in my own house for 24 hours in the guise of an income tax raid, where, you know, all my devices were taken away. I had no connection. I was not allowed to communicate with the world outside. I was not allowed to step outside the house. And I had to be within sight of the
And you think that was
people.
Because of the coverage that Quint was doing?
Now, because clearly nothing happened after that. It was really to keep you awake, not let you sleep. It's really that. And of course, I didn't know that because I had no communication. But they had also raided our various offices. They had also raided the offices, the media, the newsrooms of the organizations that the Quint has invested in. So so it's a very strange. It's not like Pakistan. It's not clear and present and obvious. It's not overt. And yet, if you watch a prime-time discussion or debate on a television channel in India, you will find that there are hashtags which are out to humiliate the opposition, humiliate anti-nationals, humiliate, and basically push the one agenda.
Yeah.
It's becoming like Pakistan.
Eventually right?
So those are the various forms of censorship. Different ways that censorship takes. I mean, it can be quite creatively done. We have the Pakistan team. Do you want to briefly tell the audience, what are the various nice creative ways used by state, government, non-state actors in Pakistan to censor media?
So basically, I mean, recently enough, the new way they've done is that, as you were talking about the financial modeling, so in Pakistan there's been a crunch in the industry financially, which is manipulated because at the same time that there are channels shutting down, newspapers cutting salaries, there are new news organizations coming up, and which are with the money we don't know where they're coming from. So there's definitely that question. The other way of censoring, for example, involves in, I mean, there's a lot of self-censorship in Pakistan, of course, but then recently we've had treason cases against journalists, then we've had distribution, so basically, for example, newspapers not reaching some parts of the country, channels getting off the cable by getting calls from the cables.
I think we have a non-South Asian audience, and we'll have to really explain to them what the cable guy does.
Yeah, so television cables is a local distribution network that is run by independent private distributors who basically distribute all the channels. So something like, so for example, when you're talking about creativity, there's one creativity, for example, is that they keep shifting the channel from up and down to, like, you know, first it's on the first number, then they'll put it on the second 20th number, then so they keep shifting it so that there's no loyalty to that channel, or it becomes harder for people to find that channel, and then it goes off, completely off also. I mean, and so that's, then, for example, I mean, this is mainstream media, this is newspapers I'm talking about, but the internet, for example, 800,000 websites in Pakistan are currently banned. There's a Pakistan Telecom Authority, PTA, which basically manages the internet sphere. In the past, we've had YouTube banned for 4 years, we've had Twitter banned, we've had Facebook banned, and then YouTube and Facebook have been collaborating with the Pakistani government. Twitter has been recently sending out legal notices. I got one, she got one. Yeah, and then I got others, then we got multiple ones after I got suspended by Twitter because the Pakistani government complained about my account. Then they basically now, I mean, and that's not just it, like, for example, so the internet sphere, but then, I mean, you know, in some ways I wanted to talk about how I'm in exile, and even in exile now they've been WhatsApping me, they've been unleashing trolls on me, they've been trying to contact, they have contacted my family back home, they have, and they contacted me, and then they would send me screenshots of my articles, of my, and usually, and say that, you know, you stop doing this, and then you can come back. So I mean, it's the, and then and basically, I mean, the way this, like the website, my own website has been banned also. So I mean, there's multiple ways that they're managing the mainstream, and now even the social media. Blasphemy, for example, when Hamid Mir there was a journalist who was shot in 2014 6 or 7 times and survived that. After that, the channel that he was working with got closed down for a blasphemy allegation that was happening for a song that was considered blasphemous on another network, and they came up with some non-state actors. So this is
just to give context to that, because that was also, it seemed what you're referring to, just to carry everyone along with us. One of the most celebrated anchors in Pakistan on the largest news organization of Pakistan, he was under attack. And it was also probably 2014 became a turning point for Pakistan as well, because it was the first time that a channel actually pointed fingers and had to pay a very big price for pointing those fingers in a certain direction. And they were punished. They were severely punished. They're still suffering from that. Yes, I'm moderating. Yes. Gul, please.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to bring a couple of other points to this. There's impunity. There's an issue of impunity around the ways in which censorship is done, and around the criminality that is going on to censor people or to punish them for their freedom of expression. Just only quoting from my own, you know, any journalists or bloggers or, you know, any dissenters who have ever been either killed, abducted, tortured, or anything, their cases get nowhere. Not one case in which the culprits have been punished. So that's a huge issue. From my own incidents, I can tell you that the chairman of the Senate's Human Rights Committee of Pakistan ordered the Inspector General Police and the Chief Minister of the province to file cases, provide security to me, and because my life was still under threat after having been released, it was not done. In fact, he asked the Chief Justice of the country to take suo motu notice. It was not done. So there's a huge amount of impunity around these crimes that are happening, and that is why more and more of them are happening. And then when we talk about censorship, we have fast-forwarded so quickly to what used to be the two topics that nobody could talk about in mainstream. And those were the issues in Balochistan, the unrest, the freedom struggle, or the human rights abuses in one of our provinces known as Balochistan. That line was not to be crossed pre-2014. And the other was talking about the military or criticizing it, and that was that. And then what happens that post-2014, very suddenly, it goes from these two to you cannot criticize the PTI, which is the political party now in power. Elections were coming close. You could not talk about political engineering. The word political engineering, which was going on in various different forms when talk shows were done on this, that word got banned, that topic got banned. Then there arose an organic Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, which originated from the tribal belt of Pakistan, where a war on terror has been going on for the last, how many years? From 2007 onwards. So a movement arose from there for their fundamental human rights, which were being violated during the war, as the war happened, and even now. That got complete blockout. Like there were massive rallies of 50,000 people and X many thousand people. There was a complete media blackout. You will not have seen in the last year and a half almost since that movement arose, a single one of them being covered by the mainstream media. So the activists were using social media to, get the news out, and then the internet would be shut down in those areas. So the activists would then record it and upload it later on when the social media came back. So the topics, the issues that became red lines has become suffocating. So I just told you about the PTM. Then on election day, when live broadcasts are done on what's going on in which constituency, so reporters are sitting, or anchors or analysts are sitting, and they're getting calls from the on the ground reporting. They could not talk about how polling agents were being pushed out of the polling booths. One man mentioned some incidents of rigging, and he was, a break was taken in that live telecast, and he was asked to leave. And then post-poll also, the opposition, mainstream opposition political leaders, their interviews could not be aired. And this then was taken to the next level where, one form of creating this information mess is to stop information coming out. And then our country took it to another level where news was being WhatsApped to run this ticker on your television station. The same tickers were coming out everywhere.
Pressure
from not just pressure, your false news. False news, propaganda being dictated to news organizations, and they are willingly actually broadcasting that. And then there's all of the things that you have described, which are not as direct as the ones we've been describing, all those things are also happening. For example, the Cybercrime Act is being used. It's a very recent one. It's being used to hound and harass journalists, bloggers, and everybody. Then there is something called the ECL, which is the exit control list. People are randomly put on that list without the procedure which is prescribed for it, so that they cannot leave the country. Certain people have even been told that we made a mistake with so-and-so blogger, we let him out. We will never let you out, because they know once people are out, they talk more. They talk more freely.
We'll just need to move forward.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. To the Indians here, Ritu and Rana. What are the things that mainstream media in India is not touching, cannot touch, cannot look at a certain aspect of a certain story? What are those stories?
Yeah, anything that is critical of the government is not a story enough for. So I don't know, how do you kind of
like what is?
I think the biggest stories that are being done in India are not by mainstream publications, with a few exceptions, but by websites. Some websites like Caravan, Scroll, and Wire, and which are the ones which are breaking the big stories. It's not that the mainstream publications in India do not have the journalists. It's just that the model, the people, the publishers are hand in glove with politicians, and the advertisements come from the government. I think the media in India has prostrated much before the government asked them to kind of bend. That's self-censorship, and that's kind of nauseating when you see that, because you kind of don't recognize this country anymore, and the journalists that you grew up, respecting, you don't see that there's the same people anymore, and the kind of stories. And when you see them taking selfies with the Prime Minister, and developing amnesia over the Prime Minister's past, that here is a man who was called by the Supreme Court of India as the modern-day Nero, who looked the other way when Muslims were being killed. I do not understand how mainstream journalists in India can develop amnesia over that fact and pretend that he's the new messiah of Hindus or people in general. That amnesia for me is very disturbing. Not just the fact that they're not doing stories enough. I think this amnesia that they've developed about leaders. So I think that's something which is...
In a way, you're saying there's a clear difference between what online media is doing and what mainstream electronic.
So if online media, like you said, the Caravan, Wire, Scroll, and the Quint, if we break a story, like for instance, Caravan broke the story on a judge who had been involved in the investigation against on the matters of the 2002 riots. And he suddenly just died, just suddenly had a heart attack in very, very strange circumstances. And basically a complex story arousing a lot of suspicion, which was broken by the Caravan. And you will find that that story is missing from a lot of mainstream. Or for instance, we had the Quint broke the story on electoral bonds, and how basically it is a means by which the powers that be are being able to allow large corporate houses to provide funding towards election campaigning with no transparency, for instance. No other media house picked up that story. So even when these stories are being broken, you would have heard about, there was a sting operation which exposed a lot of media houses as being, susceptible to, pushing a certain agenda. By the Cobra Post, it was just carried by just a handful of media houses. So a lot of the big stories are just not. You will find that a mainstream television channel, a legacy, very few of them would be doing any reportage. There's just opinion discussion matches, slanging matches in the or there is, stand-ups outside the Parliament House just reporting what happened in the Parliament today, or things like that. So reporting has stopped. There is no reporting.
Let's quickly and briefly move to the elephant in the room, the war that almost happened. So if we talk about Pulwama and Balakot, just to give a little background, on the 14th of February, there was a suicide attack on a convoy going into Jammu and Kashmir in India with the paramilitary troops. And Jaish-e-Mohammed, which is a banned organization, took responsibility. India blamed Pakistan for harboring terrorists and their mastermind. And within a few days, Indian Air Force planes came into Pakistan territory. They dropped some bombs. Nobody quite knew what happened because there was no real information, but somebody said 300 people were killed. Somebody said, no, only some trees died. So it depends which information to believe. Yes.
4 trees and
a crow. The next day, the Pakistani planes went into Indian territory. They were chased out. Indians, I don't know. I can't say there was a crash. I can't say there was a shootout because who knows who's saying what. But at the end of it, a wing commander, Indian Air Force wing commander, ended up on Pakistan territory. He was taken in captivity, let's say, by the Pakistan army. And there was a video that was released after, quite a tragic video, because it seemed like the Pakistani major and the wing commander, Abhinandan, were quite okay with each other. So it was so tragic to see them in that situation, to be put in that situation. How did the Indian media react to what happened?
I think, again, the two kinds of reporting that happened. Like I was saying, there's a whole trend to be nationalistic with your stories. So this became a wonderful situation to drum up nationalism, patriotism, and warmongering. There were news anchors who were actually baying for war. There was, I actually heard a news bulletin where, there's in Kashmir is a disputed area for various reasons, historical reasons in India, and there are separatists who feel that Kashmir should be a separate state. And I've actually heard a news anchor on prime time for half an hour for a whole show say that the security of the separatists should be taken away, and basically saying that they should be allowed to be killed. And this is, so that's one whole way in which the media went. Then there is the questioning media, which, for instance, asked, you're saying that you've killed 250 or 300 terrorists have been killed in this attack. What is that number based on? What is the evidence? And you're being shouted down as anti-nationals, saying that, look at our soldiers, look at our Air Force, look at how they're putting their lives at stake, and you're asking for evidence? You're asking your forces to provide you evidence? What do you want them to do? You want them to take selfies over every terrorist they killed? I mean, so you're being so the tone is one of ridicule, humiliation. So there is, to be fair to the Indian media, there is a fair amount of questioning. There isn't enough investigation. In any war, there is a lot of war fog. In any reporting on any war, I mean, always. But I think this, like I keep saying, I think this nationalism is so damaging.
But a lot of it was also deliberate disinformation. That was,
of course.
The number, for example, the number being killed. Supposedly nobody actually gave a number, yet every channel, everyone had a number, and nobody corrected it later on. There were fake calls that we heard of terrorists talking to each other. There was a lot going on, and dare I say, a lot more in the Indian media than what we saw in the Pakistani media.
And there was also, sorry if I can come in, there's also a lot of glossing over, a lot of lapses. For instance, the Pulwama attack, which killed 40 CRPF soldiers, there was a vehicle loaded with 350 kgs of RDX. How did such a massive security lapse happen? But you just cannot do that questioning.
And Kashmir itself did not become the issue, right?
No. So it's, yeah. Go ahead.
Yes, Ran.
Time, I think so many of us were ashamed of being a part of the Indian media or the Indian journalism setup, because what you were witnessing on television, it was not just about Pakistan, it was also casting aspersion on the Indian Muslim. For instance, I'll give you an example. When the Balakot episode happened, I did not comment for 3 days because they were waiting to see my statement because, I have still not commented. I was asked to write 2 columns on India and Pakistan and that they were in the brink of war. I did not. I'm ashamed of it, I'm embarrassed about it, but perhaps that was a senior thing to do because when you have such overwhelming nationalism, the voices of reason get drowned in that space. What happened to Kashmiri students, the attacks on Kashmiri students, and that was not being questioned on mainstream television because at that point of time, the overwhelming narrative was about let's talk about what Pakistan has done. Even the fact that when Imran Khan gave a speech, he said, I'm letting Abhinandan, we are going to, and some of us just wrote something very basic that, this is a great gesture, and perhaps this could avoid, we could avoid a war-like situation. I just perhaps put 3 words. And there was a WhatsApp forward which went around all over India, calling us traitors, especially me on the top because I'm a Muslim. Right?
Because you were saying, let's have peace. That's what...
Peace was a bad word.
Anti-war.
And I think it was, Indians humiliated themselves by just being for blood at that point of time because peace was not a word that anybody could at that point of time utter or talk about.
But this is very strange because one would think that it became a farce in a while, with the memes and everything, and social media made fun of all the journalists. And it seemed like a really bad idea, not giving them information, letting them be all nationalistic, jingoistic, and warmongering as well. And yet it kind of worked. They had the highest ratings, which is what they were going for. There was a time. And politically, it might be working.
And for all you know, Mr.
I just like to add something here because, on the other side, on Pakistan, the military media wing spokesperson did a press conference in which he thanked the Pakistani media for saying that, you did peace journalism during this time, and then everybody was really happy on the Pakistani side, taking a higher moral ground. But at the same time, if you look at the whole issue of this, then that whole self-censorship comes in because the Pakistani media was not talking about Jaish-e-Mohammed at all. The Pakistani media was not talking about the militants on Pakistani soil, which everybody knows. The Pakistani media was not talking about a seminary in that particular area where the Indians bombed, which was linked to Jaish-e-Mohammed, which access was not given, and Reuters and AFP and other international publications talked about that. So on the Pakistani side, they were taking the higher moral ground that saying that we are doing peace journalism, but it was actually self-censorship. There was no, and self-censorship, and this is going to be repeated because of that. We're going to...
Yeah, very quickly. So what was interesting to watch, once again, was that the mainstream media, it was really mostly the mainstream media. It was not people. Mainstream media on both sides became nationalistic, Indians more so than the Pakistani ones. The Pakistan side was not talking about the fact that JEM had claimed the attack and the history that exists of Pakistan-based militant organizations having done this again and again and again. It was not. On the other side, the Indian media was not talking about the actual real atrocities and human rights violations of the Indian army in the Valley of Kashmir. Sensible people needed to sit down and talk about both these things. And when you saw social media, and we have, 50 million people on social media in Pakistan alone, when you saw what they were doing or what they were talking about, you could see that the credibility of mainstream media has gone to the dogs. People were making fun of all these anchors. They were not taking, they were looking at what the international organizations had investigated, the Google images, the research, and pretty much facts have been established. But, for example, the Indian media still keeps on talking about, and Narendra Modi still keeps talking about those 300 people who were, there's no evidence they were killed. But the normal media, social media is has become a huge indicator now. Many times, I don't know about everywhere, many times it leads the mainstream media, it forces the mainstream media to talk about issues when it becomes like top trend and so on and so forth. But
can I just come in here and say this is so strange when we talk about this right now, because this is the same Indian, a part of Indian media, Times of India and Geo and Jung Group, I remember. In 2010, the two big publishing houses of the two countries got together and created a campaign called Aman Ki Asha, a hope for peace. And that is what media kind of stood for. And they all faced a lot of backlash on both sides, but they kept at it with programming and visits and everything. And now it seems that the public opinion is also changing as the mainstream media seems to be changing.
I think in Indian media is reflective of the sentiment of the ground about what people think, really. The Kashmiris now are the ungrateful lot who basically do not have any affiliation or allegiance towards the Indian state. Throughout the Indo-Pak, when we said we were on the brink of war, how many stories did we do on Kashmir and the atrocities on Kashmiris every day? And those who spoke about it were labeled as anti-nationals. I mean, at this point of time, really, it's not just about Balakot, but I don't recognize India anymore. Because while the Prime Minister was chest thumping over Balakot, you saw people on the streets with Pakistan, Murdabad, and Pakistaniyon ko maro goli. I have not seen that kind of sentiment before. The kind of hate that you saw, and that hate was not just directed towards Pakistanis, but also towards the Indian Muslims, because it is assumed that Indian Muslims have allegiance towards Pakistan as opposed to India. And that kind of hatred that you saw, it became a ground for Narendra Modi to basically deepen the kind of polarization that you witness in India between Hindus and Muslims.
And it's now unfortunately this sentiment has now become the new normal. So irrespective of the outcome of our general elections this year, I think the extent of the polarization and divisiveness is, I don't know how easy it's going to be to come back from that.
Yeah. And first we used to think that, oh no, the people of the two countries especially, they want peace. It's just political fabrication, this hostility, and it seems to be...
for example, very recently the Facebook has taken down pages from BJP, Congress, Pakistan military-run pages, and they were running propaganda about glorification of the military, glorification of this nationalism, this hyper-nationalism. These pages were engaged in this propaganda. So I'm not sure if because if you meet people to people, I've been to India a few times. The Indians have come whenever they've come. There's people to people. There's a lot of similarities and reaching out.
I believe all of us.
If I can give an example, I give in this matter of Facebook pulling down both BJP and Congress-linked pages on Facebook. It was very interesting the next morning to see the Times of India headline, because the Times of India headline only said Congress-linked pages. It did not mention the BJP-linked pages. And that's typical. And the other thing that's being done is, I think it's just bringing that in quickly. There's been a huge issue within BJP government, with the Narendra Modi government, on unemployment. Unemployment and lack of development. And they held back. There was a huge critiquing of the government because they had held back statistics that had been done by NSSO on the growing unemployment in the country. And it's amazing how the Balakot war incident completely came in and completely swept away that narrative and just brought in this nationalism. So it's also what's getting buried.
So it's helping everyone in a way.
It's helping everyone,
yes. So I'm really sorry we didn't have time for questions. There's just 4 speakers and a lot to talk about. But they'll probably hang out. Will you be around for the next 10-15 minutes outside if anybody wants to speak to them later on? Thank you very, very much for coming to this session. Thank you, panelists.